They fought Rome and won. They carved symbols on stone that no expert on earth has ever decoded. Their kings inherited power through rules no other civilization in Europe followed. They built a fortress so massive that when it finally burned, the stone itself melted into glass. And then, almost overnight, they disappeared, vanishing so completely from history that for over 1,000 years, nobody could even agree on who they were or where they came from. But in April of 2023, scientists published something that stopped the entire field of archaeology cold. For the first time ever, researchers extracted and analyzed complete ancient DNA from Pictish burials, and what they found destroyed every major theory about these people that historians had spent centuries building. If you want to know who the Picts really were, where they actually came from, and why the truth is more extraordinary than any of the legends, keep watching, because this is the most complete and most updated story of Scotland's most mysterious people ever put together in one place. Subscribe right now and hit the bell, because this channel covers discoveries like this the moment the science drops, and there's more coming. The name Picts comes from the Latin word picti. Roman writers first used it around 297 AD, and it was a broad term they applied to the various groups living north of the Roman frontier line across central Scotland. In Latin, Picti means painted ones, a reference to the body paint or tattoos that Roman soldiers reported seeing on these warriors. But what exactly the Picts called themselves? In their own language, we do not know. Because the Pictish language is gone, completely gone. No surviving texts, no translated inscriptions, no dictionary, no grammar. It disappeared so thoroughly that linguists still argue about basic facts. Was it a Celtic language? Was it something older, something pre-Celtic that had survived in the north of Britain long after Celtic languages replaced everything else to the south? Nobody can answer that with certainty. And that silence alone tells you something about how completely the civilization was erased from the record. And yet their mark is everywhere in Scotland. Across the Highlands and the northeastern coast, more than 200 carved stones still stand or have been recovered. Large slabs of rock decorated with a system of symbols, unlike anything else in early medieval Europe. These stones show animals, geometric shapes, abstract designs, and objects that researchers believe carried specific meaning. There is a crescent shape that appears again and again. There are double discs. There are mirror and comb symbols. And then there is the creature that experts call the Pictish beast, a curving, elegant animal with a long snout and flippers, sometimes looking like a dolphin, sometimes like a horse, sometimes like nothing recognizable at all. It shows up on stone after stone across the entire territory that was once Pictland. Nobody knows what it represents. Nobody knows if it was a clan symbol, a mythological creature, a spiritual icon, or something else entirely. Researchers at the University of Aberdeen, who have spent years studying the stones, believe the symbol system was likely an elite form of communication, a way of encoding names, identities, or political relationships in a visual language that only those trained to read it could understand. The earliest of these stones, found at Dunacair near Stonehaven, have now been dated to between the 3rd and 4th century AD, making this carved symbol tradition one of the oldest known in the entire British Isles. But even knowing how old they are does not tell us what they say. And that mystery, that 1,700-year-old visual language sitting in plain sight on Scottish hillsides, remains one of the last truly unbroken codes in all of European history. Now let us go to Rome. Because the Romans did not ignore the Picts. They were terrified of them. When Rome built Hadrian's Wall across northern Britain in the 2nd century AD, it was the largest military construction project the empire had ever attempted in any province. It stretched 73 miles from coast to coast, built from stone, manned by thousands of soldiers, dotted with forts and watchtowers. And it was not enough. The groups north of the wall, the people who would eventually be called Picts, kept raiding south. Rome then built a second wall, the Antonine Wall, pushing further north, trying to contain the pressure. That wall was abandoned within a few decades. Roman generals wrote with visible frustration about adversaries who struck quickly, moved through the land without leaving tracks, and vanished before any counterattack could form. They described ambushes in fog, raids on isolated outposts, and an enemy that seemed to know the terrain in a way that made them almost impossible to pin down. Roman armies were the most advanced military force in the Western world. They had conquered vast stretches of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. But they never fully conquered the people north of Hadrian's Wall. Not once. The Picts were the only northern European people that Rome failed to bring under control, and that was not an accident. It was strategy. What is becoming clearer through archaeology is that the Picts were not simply raiders. They were builders. The best evidence for this sits at a site called Burghead on the Moray coast in northeastern Scotland. Burghead Fort was the largest Pictish fortress ever discovered. It covered an area of approximately 12.5 acres and it was 3 times larger than any other comparable enclosed site in early medieval Scotland. 3 times larger. It was a promontory fort built on a headland jutting into the sea, with triple outer ramparts separating it from the land on one side, while the ocean protected the other 3. Inside its walls, the fort contained what appear to have been elite residences, ritual spaces, and at least one remarkable structure. A rock-cut well that archaeologists believe may have been used in ceremonies. The site was almost certainly the main power center of one of the most dominant Pictish kingdoms, the Kingdom of Fortriu, which flourished from the 4th to the 9th centuries. And when that fortress finally fell, when Viking forces destroyed it in the early medieval period, the fires they set burned so intensely that the stone walls of Burghead did not just crumble, they melted. The heat fused the stone into glass, a process called vitrification. Archaeologists digging at Burghead today still find chunks of that vitrified rock, glass smooth stone embedded in the ground, proof that whatever happened there burned hotter than anything a normal fire could produce. You're looking at the remains of a catastrophe that happened over 1,000 years ago, preserved in solid glass. And then there is Riney. Riney is today a quiet, small village in Aberdeenshire. Most people drive past it without a second thought. But starting in 2011, archaeologists from the University of Aberdeen began excavating the land around Riney as part of the Northern Picts project, a long-term research effort backed by over £2 million in funding from various bodies, including Historic Environment Scotland. What they found there completely changed the way scientists understand Pictish civilization. The name Riney itself comes from an early Celtic word, a Pictish word, meaning king, and the site lived up to that name. Excavations revealed the footprint of a major royal center, a fortified complex of significant size with evidence of elite craftsmanship, large-scale metalworking, ritual deposits, and burial activity. But the discovery that Professor Gordon Noble, who led the excavations, described as a watershed moment was this: the Picts at Riney were drinking wine from glass vessels made in western France, and they were using ceramic amphorae from the eastern Mediterranean, from the Byzantine world, to do it. Wine amphorae from the eastern Mediterranean in 6th century Aberdeenshire. Let that sit for a moment. The Picts were not isolated. They were not primitive. They were not cut off from the wider world, scraping by in the Scottish Highlands while civilization happened elsewhere. They were active participants in long-distance trade networks that stretched from Ireland and western Britain all the way to Merovingian France and the Byzantine Empire. They had access to luxury goods. They had the political connections to maintain relationships with some of the most powerful kingdoms and trading hubs in the known world. Professor Noble put it plainly when the findings were published in 2026. People had assumed early medieval northern Scotland was sparsely populated and politically fragmented. Riney proves that assumption was completely wrong. This was a powerful, organized place with large settlements and sophisticated connections. And at Riney, archaeologists also found intricate metalwork, including an axe-shaped pin that mirrors the weapon carried by the Riney man, the 6-foot-tall carved Pictish stone unearthed in the 1970s, which now stands as one of the most iconic images of Pictish art. The stone itself, the axe, the pin found in the ground, all of them connected, all of them pointing to a royal center of elite power that had been sitting in a quiet Aberdeenshire field for over 1,400 years before anyone thought to look. Separately, a few miles away, researchers working with the National Museum of Scotland returned to a field in Aberdeenshire that had been cleared with dynamite by 19th century laborers. In the 1800s, that clearance had turned up 3 magnificent silver artifacts: a chain, a spiral bangle, and a handpin. The workers had not dug any deeper. They had simply moved on. When the Aberdeen team went back in 2013 and began proper excavation, they discovered over 100 more objects buried beneath the soil, a find now known as the Gallcross Hoard. Coins, brooches, bracelets, fragments of Roman military equipment, pieces of native Pictish metalwork, all of it dating to the 6th and 7th centuries AD. Much of the silver was folded or broken, suggesting it was being accumulated for recycling and redistribution through trade networks. This is not the behavior of isolated tribal people. This is the behavior of a sophisticated political economy, managing wealth, controlling resources, and operating within a much larger world. Now, let us talk about how the Picts ruled. Because one of the strangest and most debated aspects of Pictish civilization is their system of kingship. Multiple medieval sources, including the Venerable Bede, one of the most careful historians of the early medieval period, recorded something that set the Picts completely apart from every other European kingdom of their era. Pictish kingship did not pass from father to son. It passed through the female line. Specifically, the new king was typically the son of the previous king's sister, or was related through maternal descent in some form. In a continent where male line inheritance was the nearly universal rule for royal power, this system was almost unheard of. Some historians have pointed to this as evidence that Pictish society accorded women a form of dynastic authority that was rare or unique in early medieval Europe. Others debate exactly how the system worked and whether the sources are fully reliable. But the core fact stands: the Picts organized their political power differently from their neighbors, in a way that those neighbors found remarkable enough to write down and remember. Whatever was at the center of Pictish identity, whatever made them feel like themselves, it ran through the mother's side. It was embedded in maternal lineage, in a way of counting kinship that no outside empire or neighboring kingdom ever fully understood. And all of this, the walls, the carvings, the trade routes, the kingship through the mother's line, the undeciphered language, all of it leads to the biggest question of all. Where did the Picts come from? Because for centuries, the theories were extraordinary. Medieval writers proposed all kinds of exotic origins. Some said the Picts had come from Thrace, north of the Aegean Sea, in what is today northern Greece and Bulgaria. Others said they had sailed from Scythia, the ancient nomadic lands of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Some said they had arrived from islands far to the north of Britain. Bede himself recorded these origin stories, though he did so with a degree of skepticism. The image they paint is of a people so different, so foreign in their customs and appearance, that surely they must have come from somewhere far away. Surely they could not simply have been the people who were always there. And this is exactly where the DNA comes in. And this is where everything changes. In April 2023, researchers at the University of Aberdeen, Liverpool John Moores University, and Stockholm University published the results of the first ever extensive analysis of Pictish genomes in the journal PLOS Genetics. The team, led by Dr. Linus Girdland Flink of the University of Aberdeen, extracted and sequenced ancient DNA from individuals buried in Pictish-era cemeteries at two sites, Lundenlinks in Fife in southern Pictland, and Ballintor in Easterross in northern Pictland. These two sites gave the study geographic range across the full Pictish territory. The researchers produced two high-quality complete genomes, the full complement of DNA from each individual, and also sequenced mitochondrial DNA from several additional individuals. They then compared those genomes against more than 8,300 previously published ancient and modern genomes from across Europe, including Iron Age populations, Roman-era populations, Anglo-Saxon populations, Viking-era populations, and present-day people from across Britain, Ireland, Scandinavia, and mainland Europe. The results were clear, definitive. The exotic origin theories, Thrace, Scythia, Northern Islands, were myths. Fantasy, as the researchers themselves put it. The Picts were not migrants from southeastern Europe. They were not an intrusion from the east. They were not a different people who had replaced whoever was there before. The Pictish individuals in the study were genetically most similar to Iron Age populations from Britain and Ireland, local people who had been living on these islands long before the Romans arrived, long before the Anglo-Saxons came, long before the Vikings sailed south. The Picts were, in the simplest possible terms, the people who had always been there. They were the descendants of the earlier inhabitants of northern Britain, stretching back through the Iron Age to populations that had been present in these islands for thousands of years. The great wall of mystery around their origins, the wall that historians had been staring at for centuries, turned out to be hiding something much simpler and much more powerful than any exotic migration story. These were the indigenous people of northern Britain. They had not come from anywhere. They had always been there. But the DNA study revealed something else that is just as important, and in some ways more surprising. The researchers also compared the Pictish genomes to modern populations living in the United Kingdom today, and they found something remarkable. The modern populations, genetically most similar to the ancient Picts, are people living in Western Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and Northumbria. Not just in Scotland, in Wales, in Northern Ireland, in Northumbria, which is in northeastern England. These populations, spread across the western and northern edges of Britain, share a degree of genetic relatedness with the Picts that suggests a deep, ancient continuity, a shared ancestry that goes back to the pre-Roman Iron Age, to a time before the island was divided into countries and kingdoms with names we recognize today. The Picts did not disappear biologically. They disappeared culturally. The people are still here. Their descendants walk the streets of Glasgow and Belfast and Swansea and Newcastle. They just stopped being called Picts. The study also looked at the relationship between Pictish individuals buried at the same cemetery. In one finding that speaks directly to the complexity of Pictish social organization, the analysis showed that among 7 individuals buried together at London Links, there was no evidence of shared maternal ancestry. They did not come from the same maternal line. In a society where inheritance and identity were thought to run through the mother's side, the absence of maternal kinship among people buried together in the same place raises new questions about how Pictish communities were actually organized. Were burial sites shared across different lineages? Did political or social bonds outweigh blood bonds in determining who was buried together? These questions are still open. The DNA answered the biggest question, where did they come from, while opening a new set of smaller, richer questions about how they actually lived. And then there's the question of why they disappeared, not biologically. We have established that the Picts biologically survived, but culturally, politically, linguistically, the Picts as a distinct identity were gone by the 10th century. Their language stopped being used. Their symbol system stopped being carved. The name itself stopped being applied to anyone. How does a civilization that lasted more than 600 years, that built the largest fortresses in early medieval Scotland, that traded with the Byzantine world, that stopped the expansion of Rome, how does something like that simply stop? Part of the answer involves the Viking Age. Viking raids hit the Pictish coastline hard in the late 8th and 9th centuries. Berghead, that enormous fortress on the Moray coast, was destroyed. Major power centers were disrupted. The political stability of Pictish kingdoms was shaken in ways it had not been for generations. But Viking pressure alone does not explain the full disappearance. The Picts had survived Roman pressure, Anglo-Saxon expansion, and centuries of internal competition. They were not simply overwhelmed by the Vikings. What appears to have happened is a gradual political and cultural merger with the neighboring Gaelic-speaking kingdom of Dalriata to the west. As these two kingdoms increasingly shared royal dynasties, military alliances, and political interests, the identity markers that made someone distinctly Pictish, the language, the symbols, the specific forms of royal ceremony, slowly gave way to a shared identity that became the basis of something new. By around 900 AD, what had been Pictland and Dalriata had merged into a single entity that we now call Alba, the precursor to the medieval kingdom of Scotland. The Picts did not fall. They were absorbed into something larger. Their kings became the kings of Scotland. Their land became Scotland. And in that transformation, the name faded because a bigger name had replaced it. Some scholars suggest that the very secrecy that once protected Pictish power made this disappearance easier. A culture built on encoded symbols, hidden meanings, and unspoken lines of hereditary authority is a culture that depends on the people inside it knowing the code. When the political structures that maintained that code broke down, when the kings who carried those lineages adopted new titles, new languages, new narratives, the code lost its keepers. And without keepers, it became noise, stone carvings that nobody could read anymore. A symbol tradition that continued briefly and then stopped, not because anyone decided to stop it, but because the people who understood what it meant had moved into a different story. But the DNA says they are still here. The battle at Dunnican in 685 AD, the moment when Pictish king Brydei, son of Bael, led his forces to a crushing victory over the Northumbrian army of King Ecgfrith, stopping the Anglo-Saxon advance northward and preserving a distinct northern identity that would eventually become Scotland. That battle was won by people whose genetic descendants are alive today. Researchers at the University of Aberdeen are still working. The 2023 DNA study was described by its authors as the beginning, not the end. More Pictish sites are being excavated. More genomes will be sequenced. More comparisons will be run. The story is not finished. What the Picts leave behind is not just a mystery, it is a mirror that shows us how a civilization can be so effective, so deeply rooted, so adapted to its landscape and its time, that it holds off every outside force for centuries. And then, when the world changes around it, transforms from within rather than being destroyed from without. The Picts were not conquered. They became something else. And that something else, the country that exists because they held the line at Dunnican, the land their descendants still call home, the genetic continuity that runs from Iron Age Britain through the Pictish centuries and into the people of Western Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland today, is still very much alive. Their language is gone, their symbols are silent, but the land is theirs, and so is the blood of the people who live on it. And thanks to ancient DNA and decades of patient excavation in rain-soaked Scottish fields, we are finally beginning to understand the people who made all of that possible. Share this video if it taught you something you did not know. Leave a comment below. I want to know which part surprised you most. Subscribe so you do not miss the next discovery, because on this channel, we follow the science wherever it leads. God created this history for us to find, and we are only just beginning to read it.